So, I'd like to speak with you briefly about global inequality. Wealth inequality has been at the center of every news media outlet's coverage over the past few weeks, and certainly now that Davos is happening, that there's coverage that's centering around that. And I want to make some comments related to Christine Lagarde, the head of the IMF, and also Miss Winnie, the head of IMF, the head of Oxfam International, talking about this issue of wealth inequality. Now, I do want to point out that when we talk about other forms of inequality, because they're all interrelated, just take race, for example. I think race is a model for looking at how we think about, look at, and frame wealth inequality is useful because, after all, race inequality in the United States, for example, has always followed labor. Emancipation of slaves was about gaining the right, to one's own labor and freedom, of course. But in the law, that it's really what that meant. And, civil rights era, marching for jobs and justice. And, of course, Martin Luther King was assassinated at a sanitation workers' march where the marchers were negotiating. And even the union that existed for such workers in that city, in Memphis, excluded them through racial practices. Now, another way race teaches us about wealth inequality is Social Security. Just look at the Social Security Act and the veterans' benefits that date back to like 1935. Well, part of the negotiation that the North made with the South was that if they could pass and support those bills to give us this, Social Security safety net and veterans benefits, which, many credit as having really birthed the modern middle class because it allowed, for example, so many veterans of World War II to go immediately into institutions of higher learning. And my college, Oberlin College, is just one of many that really transformed around welcoming and negotiating these former combatants into this new space, and in a sense, socializing them not as combatants, but as people who contribute to the society in other ways. So universities really did a lot to spearhead that. But then we also know about the redlining in housing at the same time. So the exclusionary practices of African Americans generated white wealth, because just remember, my own grandmother, born in 1922, she would have been paying taxes between 1935 and 1964 when the Civil Rights Act was passed. And so when African Americans started to be able to receive more fairly the benefits, including access to housing and therefore education markets, because our education is based on taxable income. So, those exclusionary practices of race concentrated poverty. And that concentrated poverty meant less good schools. So all those things are intertwined. So if you have people like my grandmother paying taxes into a system that they weren't able to benefit from for many years, again, we're talking about the period when SSI and veterans benefits were started to be, institutionalized to the civil rights, then we're talking, unfortunately, about an era when people will start to want to recuperate some of those funds, because those are in many ways much more traceable. And there's a book I want to share with you by Isabel Wilkerson. It's called The Warmth of Other Suns. And it talks about that generation of people in particular, but more broadly, of course, it focuses on the migration of those people, precisely because their labor wasn't formalized, systemized, taxed, and they able to benefit from those taxes and able to benefit from access to justice even. During those times, they were fleeing the South and moving towards the North. And so, wealth inequality really has its roots in constantly trying to define and determine who an elite is. And now that we have, as I heard in the Oxfam report, the Oxfam chief mentioned in the discussion that I'm talking about earlier, from Davos, based around the wealthiest people in the world getting together and saying what we're going to do with all this money. Well, she points out that there are 1 billion people who live on less than $1 a day, and we have yet so incredibly much wealth around the world. Christine Lagarde points out that if we're going to intervene in any way, of course, we have to concentrate on interventions that really do say that we're going to help people lift themselves out of poverty. Like, that has to be a focus of our social governing network. And so, as IMF chief, she bases her insights on the report that organization is able to research, and they clearly point to focusing on people who are particularly marginalized within the system of wealth inequality. And she says that women, for example, we know that women are poorer than men. The institution of marriage, for example, traditionally can still dictate that women not work. That you have a housewife, and that's a sort of valid social identity, whereas a house husband is still something quite radical. And so that's just one of the ways that we see that women are expected, to be not the main wage earner, let alone the glass ceiling. And so we start to look at the other institutional ways that people are marginalized, who become, systematically poor. And just as I was talking about before, race. So we have gender, we have race, and then people, and this is what is particularly pernicious in the system, is that, class empowerment begets class empowerment. So it actually, the poorer you are, the more difficult it is to get out of poverty, because access to, again, just education, credit, fair housing, and then to tie education to housing is just, and then, poverty itself in wealthy nations predisposes one to exposure to crime and criminality. So you could, be a well-achieving high school student on her way to the top, like Hadia was, a Chicago young woman who was shot days after, having her accolades rewarded, and acknowledged by being invited to participate in the inauguration of President Obama, the re-inauguration. And days after, she caught a stray bullet because, she just lived in a neighborhood where there are stray bullets, because of the types of policing that are there are not to police that kind of crime in that neighborhood, but to police crime such that it is concentrated in that neighborhood. And, the intricate ways that gender, race, and class, even in that situation, you see that nexus of gender, race, and class. That idea, in a sense, almost had to be a black female student, because, statistically, there are more black women in achieving. There are more women doing better in school than boys. And then you add the element of race. And so the boy who shot that stray bullet probably was one of those boys who had been systematically excluded from the educational system, particularly because of his gender and his race. And his perceived class. A teacher hears a ethnic accent and assumes that you come from that kind of background, that you can't be reformed, and the system lines up to, invite you straight to prison, the school to prison pipeline. And so, again, the pernicious ways that gender, race, and class tied together make it so that when, Christine Lagarde makes an argument that, equality is actually good for our economy, spreading wealth. And spreading wealth means what? Now look at the wealth, the concentration of wealth. You have, we have this trickle-down imagination that just, we have a rich uncle somewhere that's going to die and lives on a hill, and literally, his empire is going to trickle down, and we're going to drive by one day and just get some, fall on some cash and our little meager lives and jobs. That's one sort of fantasy, but the real fantasy about it is, and this is what gets me every time, is that, say you have a large company, and this quarter, Apple reported the biggest earnings ever by a company, $18 billion this quarter, right now. So this American company generated this much wealth for itself. Now, how did it do that? It created a platform for elite jobs. That platform could exist because, of course, there was an area in California that government funds, facilitated that there could be a concentration of knowledge in this area, tech knowledge. And so, gaining from, just the infrastructure itself, They sucked knowledge resources from all over the world. So some of the best tech minds from all over the world could find harbor there. They produced the best tech. This is being recorded right now on one of their products. At the same time, the taxes that that area that they inhabit and the wealth that they're able to generate from there with those resources, they won't go back to the public in several ways. First, production. They simply produce their products, many of them in China. So I recently saw a Panorama, BBC report about this very issue of Apple and its supply chain. So there they have, people producing iPhones in these horrendous conditions of being overworked, and Apple really trying to enforce safer working conditions, but the producers in China just going through hoops to, fraudulent activity to produce, documents that, workers consent to overworking, and all sorts of things that really diminish worker rights. So Apple, says and claims, and the CEO, bless him, claims that he, enforces, fair labor, but it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. And to what extent does such a wealthy company have to dig into its supply chain? I think it's an ethical issue, and I think that they must dig deeper into its supply chain to make sure that fair labor standards are implemented. Because you can just we've all heard of the suicides at their plants in other parts of the world. So this is one thing. The second part is, yes, there are major consumers in that part of the world, and they benefit from it. But initially, the relationship started with us here in the Western world. So not only are they not paying taxes and providing jobs for workers here because they've exported them, they're also, there's an exploitative relationship in just getting the basic tin and other resources, the metals to even produce those objects that we have, these phones, these computers, these pads, these desktops. So then you start to look at, there's a more global, the same trend that we see locally with the wealth being concentrated and not being spread through taxes. We see that relationship on a global scale. And this is something that Ms. Winnie from Oxfam again pointed out, is that on a global scale, when you have such wealth concentration, such taxes being avoided, tax dodging in that part of the supply chain as well, in that part where you extract resources literally from the earth, and these horrible colonial style relationships between Western companies and suppliers of these resources. For example, in Africa, and again, this Panorama report showed illegal mining, produced many of our, and supplied, and I'm going to put, my Nokia up here as well, because, all of the companies get their tin from these middlemen who skirt all sorts of safe, fair labor laws, because they do get illegally held, illegally mined resources. And so while, again, Apple, and its CEO can say, well, we enforce because our suppliers here, they do this. Well, actually, no. There is illegal mining, and it is having such horrendous effect. And of course, here the analogy in the oil industry is Shell in Nigeria. The way that they have dilapidated that ecosystem in the Niger Delta is just, I don't want to say it's far beyond repair. I knock on wood, but when I went there and I saw it, I was like, oh my gosh! Like, it's literally a layer of oil and just smut everywhere, gut. And these are people who've lived in harmony with that ecosystem, and it's a fragile one. The delta, the river meeting the ocean, the salt water meeting the fresh water. It's a very fragile and very unique ecosystem, and they did the same thing in the Gulf. They've destroyed it. I don't want to say that the earth is, I know Mother Earth can come back, but that's an analogy in the oil world. But just look at what's happening in tax. So when they offshore their jobs, they offshore their mailbox, so they can, get money through the Cayman Islands and not pay taxes, even in those countries where they have workers in China, miners, working in various parts of the world, many of them in Africa, where And then the corruption further erodes those workers' benefits, even through their own taxes, to benefit from generating a better infrastructure around them. It's just a really horrid concentration of wealth. And when we say the 1%, it's really difficult to say that one can gain wealth, even now, because I haven't seen it much today, fairly. There are people who do it. There are wealthy cooperative associations. But this corporation, this corporate system allows for it. It's systematic, because I'm not saying that Apple's chief is doing something illegal. I am suggesting that they are doing something immoral by not digging further, by using the 18 billion record, ever profit to dig deeper into their supply chain, much deeper, as deep as the earth that miners 10. That those 10 miners dig their hands, fingers, lungs into, to dig that deep into the supply chain and force, safe labor, fair labor that ensure justice. Because by then, that's the company's role in saying that at least by the taxes, those people and their families can benefit from their labor. Without that, wealth is concentrated. Wealth is, you get this wealth inequality, and that's how poverty is not just being poor. People working hard and doing, for oneself is one thing, but this concentration of poverty and this concentration of wealth is more than demeaning. It's amoral, as many religious leaders have said. And so I just want you to see wealth inequality. I want you to think hard, deeply, spiritually, intellectually, academically, hip-hopily. What can you do about it? How can you be a part of the solution?